So I'll take Poland first. My father was 19 years old in the summer of 1939. He was, by certainly the measures of the time and his country, he was a son of privilege. His father, speaking of lawyers, was a very successful criminal defense lawyer in Warsaw. He had a beautiful home. Has anybody here been to Warsaw? So you may know, sir, that on the side of the river just opposite the downtown, back then and to this day, is sort of a very elegant area. I don't know what the equivalent would be in Nashville or another American city, but it was a nice place to have a residence. And my grandfather's brother, my father's great uncle, was an architect. And the combination of, he was a prominent architect, and having a prominent architect for an uncle and a prominent criminal defense lawyer for a father, they were able to put together a gorgeous house which still stands, and that's another story, on the banks of the Vistula River in Warsaw. And that was my father's upbringing. He always used to say that there was a sort of endless parade of interesting Warsaw society coming in and out of that home when he was young and when he was a teenager. His mother won for 3 years running the mayor's prize for the best garden in Warsaw. And the summer of 1939 in Poland was really governed by two assumptions. Not even, I mean, there were more than assumptions. They were just kind of, it's a matter of not whether but when. Assumption number one, that the Germans were coming. They had already, by that time, I don't need to tell this group, been the Anschluss in Austria had happened, Sudetenland had happened, and Poland was in the hair trigger. How was it going to happen? When was it going to happen? Was really just the subject of national conversation and preparedness to some extent. The other part of the conversation, the assumptions were that France and Great Britain were going to, if and when this happened, France and Great Britain were going to come to the rescue. And of course that today sounds like a really naive and perhaps foolish assumption, but that was an assumption and a pretty widely held assumption because those commitments had been made and they'd been made publicly. So September 1st, 1939, that's the snapshot that anybody, I mean, around the world obviously, but certainly if you were a 19-year-old in Warsaw, that's the snapshot you remember. And I heard all kinds of accounts from all kinds of perspectives about what that day was like. My father was roused early, and he and his father were on the balcony of that lovely house, and they saw the German planes in the air. And in a way, the rest is history, and I don't want to delve too much on it other than to say that for my father, the next, he had had some training as a soldier, but not enough to be ready to do anything or go anywhere, and his basic assignment was to get his younger cousins out of the city. As things got worse and as it became apparent very quickly that there was not going to be any French or British anything, at least not for the time being. And so my father's war snapshot, if you will, was really, as I reflect on it, a kind of 9-month drama, which was terrifying and which took him first to the outskirts of Warsaw, where he was able to safely take a family vehicle and get his cousins out. Ultimately, as things got worse across the Romanian border, they, like a lot of other refugees from that country, again, perhaps because of the French and British promises and pledges, they thought at every step they took, well, it's just, we got to go a little further, but we're going to go back, or we're going to. Anyhow, my father's next trip was made by rail to Paris, which I don't know exactly when he did that, but either late '39 or early 1940, and that seemed like a safe refuge. Well, a few months later, my father and a Polish gentleman who was his age, and I don't know how they connected, but the Poles, like other nationals, found each other. He found this man named Tadeusz Pawlowicz, and they hooked up and started, as the Germans came for Paris, it probably would have been the subject of a whole other book. a crazy, dangerous flight south as the Germans came to Paris, and two 19-year-olds from Poland really had no place in that situation at all, nor any means to really make a stab at it. The home, he learned much later, had been ransacked by the Germans, not destroyed. My grandfather, my father's father, and his mother made it to London, where ultimately, Rod was reminding me to make a point of this. I don't know too much about this other than my grandfather was given a post in the British government in exile in Poland, which was almost as much of a, I mean, it was paid attention to at the time, but it was as much of a fantasy in terms of its ability to do anything as the fantasy of the French and British coming to the rescue. And so what happened to my father when he and that other fellow made it down to the south of France, and this became a pretty common route out, not just for Poles, to the port of Biarritz in southwestern France. There were ships leaving to take people out. I don't know how he got on the vessel he got on, but he did. And they were making their way back up to the British Isles. September of 1939 and June of 1940. And that brought him up to London, where he was spirited very quickly to Scotland. In Edinburgh, it turned out already, there was a community of Polish fighting-age men who were being trained. They were training people by nationality if they were coming in that way. Probably another book, and actually I think books have been written about the Polish experience in Scotland and in Great Britain. But there all of a sudden things slowed down because they were preparing for what they thought was a fairly imminent, invasion or some activity. And they trained there for nearly 4 years before D-Day. So I'll go back to Norway. My mother was, my father died a long time ago. My mother only passed away a few years ago. And she was a lovely and very sort of, I guess it's the Scandinavian stereotype, don't talk too much about yourself, quite humble person. She always had, as did some of her relatives, a little bit of a chip on their shoulder because they felt, sure, it's nothing like Poland in terms of the suffering. It's nothing like those of you who served in the war, your experiences. But she would always tell me, please don't forget what we went through. And it's not, in the annals of the horrible things that happened to people in World War II, Norway doesn't exactly stand out. But she was 14 when the Germans came to occupy her country. And in a nutshell, I would say, and this I have from having had a lot of conversations with her and her relatives and read fairly deeply about it, that was just a long-standing, tough, and occasionally brutal occupation. You were talking, Charles, about ration cards. My mother remembered those very well. The no Jews on the subways and the trains and the trams and everything. And there was a Norwegian underground. Nothing, again, like the Polish underground and maybe other nations, but there was a very active Norwegian underground operating against Quisling, who was the German installed puppet there, and whose name became synonymous with treason and traitors, I guess. And in that Norwegian occupation, Norwegian underground movement to fight the occupation, my mother's first cousin, and she was an only child, so one of her closest relatives, Peter Young, and he was shot by the Nazis at age 19 during the occupation. So her point was always that, don't forget that we had a rough go too. I should mention also on the subject of family members lost, again, my family kind of emerged compared to others relatively unscathed, but the architect back in Poland, who I mentioned, who built that and designed that gorgeous house that still stands in Warsaw, Juliusz Nagorski, was one of the relatives who stayed, and he was executed in the latter days of the war in Warsaw. Is in their own right, in their own way. And I'll just share two, I thought, in very uplifting stories that, of all the stories my parents told me, have always stuck with me. And they're very different. So my dad on that, I would ask him, but he didn't live long enough for me to, he died in his 60s, so I never really got the full first-person account. I guess I didn't start asking the questions soon enough. But I would ask him about that escape from France in particular, because that just seemed, you know, nightmarish in a way that some of the others hadn't been. He was a person without an identity with this other guy. He could speak pretty good French, though. So, and I'm sure the details are a little bit mangled over time, but somewhere near Bordeaux, as they're headed south, not sure about their end destination. I don't think they even knew about those ships going up north. My dad and his buddy get a hold of some French uniforms. I don't know how that happened. I don't think my dad even remembered really how it happened, but they're wearing French military uniforms as they head south, because they're 19-year-old guys, and 19-year-old guys at that point should be wearing a uniform of one sort or the other. And they're headed south the way people headed south during the war, whatever their situation, hitchhiking, trying to commandeer a Jeep here or there. And they're about to jump into a Jeep somewhere near Bordeaux, and there's clearly a senior military guy at a checkpoint who stops the vehicle, and everybody gets out. Seems like a routine check. And this guy looks at them just as he's about to give the all clear and let them go. And he looks at the, whatever, the epaulettes or the insignia on the shoulders of my dad's uniform and his friends. And he says, "Ah, c'est mon régiment, it's my regiment." And my dad, oh, and I should say that my father had instructed his friend to say, if you're asked any questions, because he couldn't speak good French, you're mute. You're just mute. You have a problem. You don't, so I'm doing the talking. Good. So Tadeusz doesn't say anything, but he's just thinking, oh my, you know, what is George going to say, my dad? C'est mon régiment, you know. And he says, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé avec mon régiment? What happened to my regiment? Please tell me. And this story I heard from the other guy who lived into his 90s, Tadeusz, and he's thinking, you know, we're done for. Because what on earth is your dad going to say to this guy? And without missing a beat, he sort of shoos Tadeusz into the Jeep, and he puts his hand over his heart, and he says, "Ils sont tous perdus, mon colonel," which means they're all lost, Colonel. Which, I don't know where he came up with that. It's obviously nonsense. He didn't know any regiment from any other in France, but he just thought he had to say something dramatic enough to get the guy to just not pay attention for a second. He didn't know what side this colonel was on or anything. In they go to the Jeep, off they go. And the other guy said he never forgot looking in the rearview mirror at the colonel, who's sitting there for a second thinking, wow, my regiment is all lost. And then he could see in his face, you know. But it was good enough. It bought them, you know, 100 yards or whatever. They're not going to, whoever these guys are there. My mom's story that always stuck with me was really actually uplifting. And, you know, again, I don't need to tell you. I'm sure you all have your VE Day stories or VJ Day stories. But, of course, I would ask my mom, and she told me, even if I wouldn't ask, what it was like when that occupation ended. And the story she told me was about all these GIs who suddenly turned up in Oslo. And I don't know how long after VE Day that was, but there are guys out in the street and they're running around, and the Norwegians are, just as it was in Paris and all these other European capitals, they're going and giving them hugs. And there was some kind of game of softball or baseball or stickball or something that suddenly erupted on Thomas Heftesgate in Oslo, which was the street my mom grew up on. So my grandmother, my mother's mother, says, you know, you go out and meet some of them, and if they're interested, invite them over, because that's what people are, we should invite them into our homes. Really, Mom? Wow. So my mom is now, let's see, 45. My mom is 19 now. And okay, I get to invite American soldiers into the home. That's great. So they invite somewhere around 24 American soldiers came into this house, and I'm sure it happened all over Oslo, and it had certainly happened all over Paris, and I don't know where else. And they had this incredible time. And, you know, they'd had, as I said, they'd had ration cards in Oslo, but all of a sudden, there was, I guess some of the Americans had been into the storehouses that the Germans had kept there. And so they had some stuff. They had some, I don't know, caviar, and they had all kinds of, and they brought this stuff in. And in return, certainly my grandmother and grandfather and my mother shared everything they had. This was an incredibly memorable thing, but even better. A couple of months later, my grandmother, Ingrid Young, gets, I don't know why she got all the credit, not my grandfather, but never mind, gets a letter from Alabama. And I so wish I had that letter, but I'd heard it described to me so many times. I want to thank you, Miss Young, for your hospitality, because my son said to me that he had not had a meal in a home, and more important, the hospitality of a home anywhere for years, however many years he'd been in the theater. And I just want to thank you, you know, but this guy had taken the time and I guess written down the name and the address and everything else. And so my mother never forgot that. You know, I never think that these stories, as great as they are, really, in the scheme of things, add up to so much given the whole panoply of amazing things that happened during the war. And I certainly, when I was in my 20s, 30s, become a journalist, I figured I had heard all the great stories within my family that there were to hear. And the fact was that I had missed a big one, and one that without question was more compelling and more wide-ranging, and I've shared it with a couple of you. But in terms of explaining that connection, I just thought I'd read a very little bit. It's actually the prologue of this book, because this book has nothing to do with my dad in Warsaw, nothing to do with my mom in Norway. But I'm going to take a sip of water and then share this with you. And Bogdan Nagorski was my great uncle, a brother of my grandfather, the lawyer, and the architect. I first heard the story on a Christmas Eve sometime during the late 1970s at the New York apartment where Wigilia, the Polish Christmas Eve dinner, had been celebrated in my family for as long as I could remember. My father was Polish, born in Warsaw in 1920, and my mother Norwegian, Oslo, 1925. And when I was a child, my Christmas holidays were divided roughly between Norway and the apartment in Lower Manhattan, where my father's cousins lived. The patriarch of the family was my father's uncle Bogdan, and he could make several claims to his place at the head of the Wigilia table. He was the oldest living Nagorski, for one thing. His birthday happened to fall on December 24th, for another. And he was a warm and charming man, funny, and above all, a superb raconteur. By the time I came to know Bogdan, he was a hunched figure, slow-moving, and almost completely deaf. The gesture I came to associate with him was a hand cupped over an ear as he leaned close, watching the lips of whoever was speaking. He was a frail man by then, but his wit and warmth shone through. "It isn't fair," he would say to me. "You're growing like a tree, and I'm only getting smaller and smaller." The annual Christmas Eve highlight was Bogdan's poem, verse that he composed in which he would recite without notes sometime between the main dish and dessert. It would be his survey of the year, essentially, a collection of musings, and it was invariably interrupted by laughter, real laughter, not the polite or sympathetic kind. Bogdan would deliver his poem in Polish, the language of the dinner, and my mother and I would struggle to grasp the essence, helped by my father or a cousin with the translation. But we never missed the twinkle in Bogdan's eye or the delight etched on faces around the table. These were unmistakable. It was on one such evening, in the din of cross-table conversation, that I picked up what seemed to be a remarkable phrase, the punchline to a story. "The obituary was written," Bogdan's wife Zosia was saying, waving a hand in the air. "Imagine, I was reading about the death of my husband in a newspaper. And look, he's sitting here now, all these years later." Fragments of the story followed. Bogdan had been then a passenger in one of the ship's lifeboats. Logic and reports from the scene had made it clear he was lost in the North Atlantic, starved or drowned hundreds of miles from land. London press dispatches described a harrowing night and the following day's rescue of only a few dozen frostbitten souls. Bogdan Nagorski had not been among them. At the time, he was 49 years old. She had no faith, Bogdan cried, smiling at his wife. More laughter echoed around the dinner table. Bogdan, Bogdan, Zosha said, sounding exasperated. Of course I had faith. You know I had faith. She shook her head, laughing softly. She had heard Bogdan's story many, many times. But for those of us who hadn't, it was easy to understand why Zosha or anyone waiting for the ship's lost passengers might have abandoned faith that September all those years ago. The story came to me in patchy fashion, snippets tossed across the dinner table. It was fascinating to imagine my great-uncle drifting in a lifeboat or sitting later in some London apartment reading his own death notice. But I was young, I was a teenager, and I suppose my curiosity fizzled. One evening in the summer of 2001, my wife and I enjoyed a dinner with Bogdan's daughters, my wife obviously being Brod's daughter. We enjoyed a dinner with Bogdan's daughters. They had been young girls in 1940 waiting in Montreal for their father's ship to arrive. We sat on the terrace of their home in Hampton Bays, New York. We talked about Bogdan and Zosha, about the older generation generally, and the talk drifted to stories about the war. It was during that dinner that the story of the ship, the SS City of Benares, surfaced. This time absent the frenetic atmosphere of Christmas Eve, and this time I was a journalist with a fairly intense curiosity about the war and about this astonishing story that unfolded, Barbara and Christine Nagorski telling it in greater scope and with much richer detail. Enough to send me on something of a mission to learn more, to find the people who had shared in Bogdan's miracle, the children in particular, to uncover the accounts not only of his fellow passengers but of his rescuers, as well as the men on board the submarine that had fired the deadly torpedo. Enough, in short, to produce this book, because it was, by any measure, an almost unbelievable story. So that's the things that his daughters, who are still alive, had kept for all these years, that the ship he was on, as I said, he was a paying passenger, but its prime purpose at the time was to carry 100 child evacuees from Great Britain to Halifax. And it was part of a program that was only a couple of months old at that point, that the British government had set up for families who felt the danger was too great at home in London or wherever they were. And unlike a lot of other families who were sending their kids to second homes or to families in the country, they didn't have that opportunity. So the rules were if your child was between 5 and 15, and if you were willing to sign a document that said it's for the duration of the war. So your kids might be gone, I mean, who knew? Your kids might be gone for a few months or for years. In the event, obviously, those who made it were gone for a long time. But the whole contract was you're going to have safety. Your kids are going to be far away, but you're going to have safety. And that's what these kids didn't have, because as I've explained to some of you we were sitting together, they did a pretty good job in the initial runs of providing naval escorts for these kids on these liners. But somebody missed a stitch, and they had originally calculated the U-boat range for the Germans on the basis of the ports in Germany. And what they hadn't factored in was that the capture of France meant that all those U-boats had moved over to ports to the west in France. And all of a sudden, the range was much further, and so it was no longer satisfactory at all for those boats to turn around. They did, and a great tragedy happened, but the book is called Miracles on the Water because some great things, including the survival of my great-uncle, happened as a result. So maybe I'll stop there, except to say that there's another coincidence and timeliness to having me here, which is the day after tomorrow is Doug Fisher's birthday. So I only brought one copy, and Doug, this is yours. So happy birthday. Thank you. Should I stay?
How was it he came safely? Or should we read the book? Read the book.
Well,
Read the book.
I'll do both.
I'll tell you, the most interesting thing to me, first of all, the ship sank at 10 at night. I mean, and it went down in 31 minutes. So pretty much I don't think you have to be a naval expert, but any experts I talked to were quite amazed that there had been any rescue. But there was part one of the book really, after the wreck, after the attack, describes in great detail the incredibly heroic British naval dispatch. A destroyer was sent out there, went at probably dangerous speeds, got out there the next day. But there was also all kinds of heroism, and some of it was exhibited by the children themselves during the night, because they all had to survive the night. So there was one set of rescues carried out the next day. But really the amazing thing, and the reason why, and since you already know my great-uncle survived, I'm not spoiling anything, but the amazing thing about his survival, and the reason why there were memorials held for him, was that some of you are Navy veterans, right? At any rate, I had never heard the term box search. So a box search that this destroyer carried out as it got into the late afternoon is done by just basically figuring out where a lifeboat could be and doing up and down and covering that box. And what they realized, but they only realized when they were almost halfway home, they realized two things. Number one, they had picked up or accounted for 12 lifeboats, and this ship had 12 lifeboats. Only when they're halfway back and they're interviewing survivors, they realize that there's a lifeboat there that has nothing to do with the Benares. So they've got some people, it's nice, they rescued these people who were on some small cutter that it wasn't even a maritime thing. I think they just had capsized out there, so they've picked up these other people. Very nice. So there's a lifeboat that they haven't accounted for. Now, having seen, and this is in the book too, the hell that they found on the water out there, because most of the boats they found were full of dead people, including, I'm sorry to say, a whole lot of dead kids. So they could not, it wasn't even a second of thinking, do we go back and look again, because it's already dusk? There's no way there's another lifeboat out there that's okay. The other thing they hadn't counted for is a lifeboat in good shape that hasn't had any kind of trauma, is full of some members of the crew who had survived. And what had they done? They had, from the moment this thing went down, they had gotten in their lifeboat and they had just been going away, right? So they weren't in the box. That's where my great-uncle was. But the truly amazing thing was the search was over. So they are out there, I'm not sure I mentioned the distance, they're out there more than, I think in the end, more than 600 miles out in the North Atlantic, and nobody's looking for them.
Tom, what was the
And
date?
some of those kids are still alive today.
What was the date of the sinking? The date of
It sailed on the 13th of September,
40?
1940, and it went down, I believe, on the 17th. I have wonderful, actually, you know what? You get me started. So one of the really wonderful things in those, and I'm not... great joys of working on this was that almost everyone who survived, not surprisingly, had a little shopping bag or a suitcase, and that included the naval veterans who carried out the rescues. I mean, anybody who had a part in this, it was a hugely profound, if not their most profound, wartime memory. And so I went through all kinds of first-hand documents. But my favorite by far, which I found that night when I first talked to his daughters about it. So here's a telegram that went to my grandfather, who was in London with the Polish government in exile, on the 22nd of September, 1940. Deeply regret inform, this is telegram language, right? Deeply regret inform you, vessel by which your brother Mr. B. Nagorski traveling has been sunk by enemy action, and his name is not included in list of survivors. Done. Following week. Very pleased to inform you, further survivors landed at Northern Port Thursday night include your brother Mr. B. Nagorski, previously reported missing. So
You said you also were able to contact some of the U-boat crew?
I never met them in person, but there my great resource was the Imperial War Museum in London. And they had all the testimonials that were given by the commander, who actually wound up, he was a highly decorated U-boat guy, and he also wound up having a nervous breakdown. So he was sort of an interesting guy in his own right. But then there was a radio operator who lived well into his later years and was completely unrepentant. I mean, almost unbelievably and inexplicably unrepentant, and tried to arrange get-togethers, later on to have reunions, and some of the kids agreed, but most of them did not. Yeah.
What's almost as remarkable.
Taken a couple of shots before, and those were all documented in the U-boat's logbook. And this one hit, it's 8 years ago. I'd remember these details better than I do now, but I do remember the timing. 10:03 it was hit, and 10:34, again, it was the U-boat wrote, Benares is under. And so it was in that period. Now, it was not as big a ship as the Lusitania, although there's pictures in here, and it's a pretty good-sized luxury liner. The kids who survived, and actually some of the adults too, but the kids, they were lower, that was the whole point of the program, they were lower class London, and so they had never been anywhere, and they certainly had never seen or been on a ship like this. And it was called City of Benares. Benares is the city in India now known as Varanasi. And it used to run the old colonial run to India. So it was a big, beautiful luxury liner, and they just thought they were in heaven for those first few days on that ship.
Do you remember if coal was stored on the outer perimeters of the hull?
I don't. I do have one of the things that, and I can't even remember now where I found it, but my wife was very kind enough to mount it for me. I have an incredibly, it's sort of the, the designer's drawings of the ship, so I could probably find that out, but it's in, and you can tell, just by, there's a, there's a butcher room and a confectioner's room, and so it was, but I don't know the answer to your question. Now, there was a whole other thing that came up. Churchill, who, by the way, was not a fan initially, it's a whole other backstory, which I deal with in the book, about how this program got through, despite the fact that he thought it was a bad idea, number one, terrible morale thing. You're going to just publicly ship all these kids out of our country. It's defeatism. So he didn't like it for that reason. And second, he said, 13, 14, 15-year-old boys, you must really think this war is going to be done within a year or two, because I don't want my 15-year-old boys going anywhere right now. So anyway, he was, but when this thing happened, he played it to the hilt for propaganda. And so I was mentioning this to one of the others here before, that there's, one of the questions I was asked a lot is, was there evidence to support that the Germans knew the mission of this ship? And there's zero. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of criticism levied against the British because they did not fly, Red Cross flags. They just counted on that escort to work. But the headlines were all, Hun savagery goes after, as if they were purposely looking to kill British children. And as horrible as the attack was, there was no evidence. And then came a whole bunch of counter, I think, conspiratorial thinking that that the British were throwing a lot of gold and other things on these ships to get them out, putting kids on them to make them unattackable. But that doesn't stand up either, in my view, because then you would have told everyone there are kids on the ship. So,
Very nice.
yeah.